Right. Today we are going to talk about international cooperation and international law. Welcome to this POS 360 International Relations presentation. So I want to begin with images of what we might consider international law. One is actually the interior of the United Nations office in Nairobi, one of the few United Nations offices anywhere outside of Europe and North America. The picture in the middle is the International Criminal Court, and that's in The Hague, the Netherlands, and on the right is another picture of the United Nations office in Nairobi. This, I think, is a good introduction to international organizations. This picture is actually one of the International Criminal Court, actually in progress. The International Criminal Court has often been called or dubbed the Court for Africans. I suspect there's some African now. In this picture, brought before the International Criminal Court. But these are really examples of international law that is being leveraged through international organizations. And so we shall be talking about both of these. And so I want to lay out the objectives of what we shall be talking about. So we'll talk about international cooperation and what it is. Think about why some think that international cooperation is difficult, even though evidence shows that this is not always the case, that there can be international cooperation even after major events. As I record this, China's President Xi Jinping is actually in the US, and reports emerged that there is, even though they might not fight a hot war, the US and China will seek to cooperate. And these are arguably some of the most strained relations that are currently evident. So we shall also be looking at how theory explains cooperation in instances of lack of cooperation. Think about the definition of international law, its sources, and its applications, and why states comply with international law, even though they really do not have to. But so to maybe think about cooperation among nations, it's useful to think about a concept that is generally found in international relations. So dilemmas of common interests and dilemmas of common aversions. So these are, of course, an academic definition. Dilemmas of common interests, where actors have a common interest in ensuring a particular outcome. So, for example, you would think that most countries in the world would want to see everyone perhaps healthy and prosperous. Well, this is, of course, an assumption, and maybe living at peace. So this is a particular outcome. The question, though, is how that can be achieved. And the dilemmas of common aversions are those dilemmas that present to states because the states have a common interest in avoiding a particular outcome. I think there would be very few actors or states that would want to see thermonuclear bomb go off or the world economy crash. And so what do states do, and how do they do it to avoid that particular outcome? Now, in this particular case, the actors do not necessarily prefer the same outcome. Some countries might want to fight, but others might want to increase their power, but others may prefer that there is no bloodletting. But there's an outcome they want to avoid, and so, for example, nuclear fallout, Holocaust, or nuclear war would be one such outcome. And so they will coordinate. And so one of the ways that you see this coordination is, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because they want to avoid a particular outcome. And this will not satisfy everyone, because if you think about the countries that want nuclear weapons, they do want to, even though we cannot say that they necessarily want to explode the nuclear weapons. But so when every country is making its decision, these are independent decision making, and so we talk about the equilibrium outcomes that are Pareto deficient. So there is the outcome that is achieved. However, the actors would probably prefer another outcome to the equilibrium outcome, even though so far we haven't seen the world go up in nuclear war. So perhaps these dilemmas of common interests and common aversions have worked. And so in theory, in a perfect world, the Pareto frontier shows the optimal decision line. And so anything that is below the Pareto frontier will be defined as Pareto suboptimal outcome. And this is in many things, not just in international peace and negotiations and those kinds of things. So when we think about cooperation, we think about the theoretical approaches and what the different theoretical sides suggest is possible and is not possible. And so especially for realists, because of the assumptions that realists have, for example, there is no power above other powers to compel countries to do what they need to do, or to compel them to not do the things that they want to do. There is therefore the likelihood that a country will do whatever it wants to do, for example, pursue nuclear weapons. And we can see, for example, North Korea doing something like that, Iran. But so cooperation in certain areas can be difficult to achieve, because especially relative gains, so how much more one state gains over another in interaction, can be overriding and compelling. So for example, if Iran is more powerful than the countries in the region, in the Middle East, then that might be more compelling. So relatively it's more powerful than other countries, but perhaps not as powerful as China, Russia, or the United States. But we also run into the problem of cheating, because there's no power to regulate conduct in what countries can, will, and should, and must do. Then the cooperative or nice behaviors of others can be taken advantage of. This leads me to actually think of, for example, Costa Rica, which doesn't have a military. If any country wanted to really take advantage of Costa Rica, could they not? And so that might be part of the weaknesses of not having a power to compel other powers or to regulate behavior of other powers. And so because countries know that cheating exists, there is nothing to compel them to not do things, so that even if cheating occurs, it's minimized, because they have already done the things that they have already done mitigation strategies. So for example, even with the nuclear non-proliferation, we still see countries that went ahead and cheated and actually had nuclear programs. And so it's almost like knowing that the incentives to cheat exist and that nobody can regulate whether countries cheat, because even if it's IAEA, we see, for example, Iraq kicking the IAEA inspectors out of the country. And so what can be done to compel them? Most of these inspections are on a willing case. And so this becomes quite a challenge. But so we should also maybe think about the broader international organizations theory, because international organizations in theory can help increase cooperation and mitigate cheating. And so there's quite a number of theories that help us to explain the existence of international organizations. So for example, regime theory, and regimes are not just the bad actors states, they are agreements. So, for example, we talk about regime sanctions. We talked about decentralized cooperation theory. So countries can cooperate on certain issues in certain regions, across certain times, even when they are literally almost fighting each other. Of course, is there other maybe 3, 4 major IR theories like realist theory, constructivist theory, liberal, but especially neoliberal institutionalism, the offshoot of liberalism. But we also need to think about states being the principal actors. And as principal actors in international relations, they often seek vehicles to create social order, and these can especially stem from or be vehicles such as international organizations. So when thinking about international cooperation, it is true that actors must mutually adjust their behavior to accommodate actual or anticipated preferences of others. In other words, this thing that you're cooperating on, what is it going to require you to do? And so, for example, countries like Japan and Germany long ago decided that they were not going to pursue nuclear weapons, and so this is one of the accommodations that they do. But again, we have to also think about nations having different preferences. One of the things that realism talks about is that actors, of which states and organizations are, have preferences. Now, these preferences are not necessarily identical or irreconcilable, but states will find areas and ways of cooperation. Now, usually when states adopt the behavior that is consistent with their interests, but also things that they are willing to maybe give up or cooperate on, then we see that preferences can be very important in meeting these objectives. It's probably the case that most countries, most states want to avoid war. They want to advance economically. They want to maybe reduce trade imbalances or stop the proliferation of cybercrime. If we think about, for example, the Pentagon Papers, and it's not WikiLeaks, Panama Papers. Panama Papers, these exposed a lot of high-ranking individuals, private business, and so something like cybercrime, it's pretty almost certain that countries might want to avoid this because it can be embarrassing. And so we can see cooperation in these kinds of instances. Now, sometimes cooperation is not that easy, and I think everybody remembers this image of the G7 countries, particularly in the apparent confrontation, or at least adversarial conversation that was occurring between the G7 leaders and the US president. And so cooperation is not always easy, and especially when a state expresses certain preferences that do not align with identified goals. So for example, G7 is it's probably not a formal organization with a secretariat, but it is a grouping of states that have certain characteristics. And so if you think about the things that they agree to cooperate on, that can be a challenge. Now, we should probably talk about relative gains and absolute gains. So relative gains really refers to how much more a state gains over another in a given interaction. It is rare for states to be competing against all other states, and usually they will be competing against one or a group of states within a region. As I previously mentioned, for example, in the Middle East, you will see countries jockeying for regional influence. There are few countries that really jockey for global influence, even though we do see, for example, in the case of the Chinese balloon spying, that was largely global, but a lot of countries are jockeying for regional. And so they focus on most of their enemies will be from the same region or allies of countries in the same region, and so that is where most of the threat will come from. And so we sort of see states will focus on the region, and so relative gains, relative power over the countries that are in the region is often most important to states. And so there's that example, for example, gaining 3 billion and one gaining 1.5 billion. So there's absolute gains, but there's relative gains in which one has more than the other, and that is an advantage that can be leveraged in certain ways. We see, for example, in terms of trade, Germany has quite a bit of advantage in global trade, and so these are examples of how relative gains can actually drive a country to be more powerful. Now, even though we shall talk about prisoner's dilemma, the idea is that two individuals are arrested by the police for having committed a crime, and so they have usually, and this might be different in different parts of the world, but the police will most likely interrogate the two individuals separately, and if they have not coordinated their stories, then they don't know what to say and what not to say, unless of course they subscribe to the snitches get stitches philosophy, and then the default position would be not to snitch. However, if this is not coordinated, or if there's some chicanery, for example, if the police tell person A that person B has confessed or has said it's person A that did the crime, then person A might be tempted to tell all. And so the idea is almost like, if A testifies and B stays silent, A gets a better deal. If B testifies, A stays silent, then B gets a better deal and A gets a terrible deal. If both of them testify, then the police know everything, and so that is probably the worst outcome. And if both of them stay silent, then in theory the police know nothing. Of course, this must not be in London because cameras and everything. And so if a prisoner, prisoner or the accused stay silent, this is cooperating with the other prisoner, not with the authorities. If they tell all, then they are defecting, and so the strategies for prisoner's dilemma are cooperating or defecting. And so if you sort of think about prisoner's dilemma in the application of cooperation, if two countries sit and agree not to pursue nuclear weapons, but then one country decides that despite the agreement it's going to pursue nuclear weapons, then it's defecting. And so the country that believes that the other country is not pursuing nuclear weapons will have the worst outcome, because it's sitting there pretty and thinking, oh, we have an agreement and we are not pursuing nuclear weapons. And so so the individual incentive for each of the whether it's in international cooperation or in prisoner's dilemma, the best individual strategy is to defect. Because if you defect, you tell the police everything that you get a better deal. But if you defect and the other person defects, so basically both of you, everything is known, and there's then no incentive to give you a better deal. So the best joint strategy is to cooperate with each other and say nothing, and then probably get a smaller sentence. But the question is, when you're separated, how do you know what the other person will do? And this is really the crux of prisoner's dilemma. And so if they both defect, that is the worst possible outcome. He's maybe the diagrammatic view of prisoner's dilemma, confessing, remaining silent, and sort of the outcomes for each of the prisoners, and maybe the mathematical calculation of the same. Now, the other thing that internationally individuals and organizations must worry about is what we call free riding. So imagine there is a situation that where an individual, and really this bicycle is really perhaps the best example. So it takes three to cycle effectively, but one person has decided not to do that, and so they're just being carried along. So they are free riding, and you see a lot of these, for example, in situations where countries do not incur a specific cost. For example, pirates. If you think about global commerce and how it goes through certain places and how some countries don't have navies, I'm looking at you, Kenya and maybe Somalia. So whenever there's pirates, the countries that will be pulled into anti-piracy duty will be the major countries within major navies, and so everyone in the world benefits because these countries are keeping the world safe for commerce. Now, it's probably not Kenya's fault. They don't have a navy, but they do have a navy, like 3 boats maybe. But the important thing is that there will be countries that are benefiting from others providing a service. At the same time, if you think about the other side of the equation, for example, if you consider something like the climate crisis, the U.S. has been accused of producing about 25% of the world's waste, only having about 4% of the world's population as of 2023. And so the question is the US free riding whenever there are discussions about reducing the carbon footprint because it's taking advantage of other countries? And when they sea level rise, it's countries like Kiribati, which are it's a convoluted way of thinking about free riding, but it's important to think about the implications of this. Now, when we think about how we think about issues around the world, so for example, prisoner's dilemma, it's rare that whether it's the rare person who goes and commits a crime with someone they do not know. And so one thinks that if you're going to commit a crime, you're committing a crime with someone you know and you have prior understandings and knowledge, and maybe you know where they live and their family and so on. And so you're familiar with them. So this would be sort of the convoluted element of the iterated prisoner's dilemma. So it's rare for interactions to be only in one field or once. And so if there's repeated interactions, we talk about iterated prisoner's dilemma. So the game is not only played once, and so there is learning that occurs. So for example, if I'm playing the game and the parties that I'm playing against have a habit of defecting, then I might actually switch to a tactic called tit for tat. I will do what they will do. If they defect, I will defect, even though that is not the best maybe joint strategy, because if we both defect and it's on nuclear weapons, then we are all going to have nuclear weapons, or we are going to ruin the environment or some other thing. But so in international relations, it's the case that there will be opportunities for cooperation several times, and so we think about the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And so when we think about, for example, NATO's common foreign policy, common foreign and security policy, the EU is going to be next to each other, among the same members for, other than Brexit. But so, for example, it's very rare that Germany and France will move away from each other, or the US and Canada. And so there's probably usually more opportunities for cooperation. And so you see, for example, the US, Mexico, Canada, or USMCA, or the treaties of the European Union. So these are repeated iterations. Think about the Kyoto Protocol verification system. So you can reduce cheating or defection by putting into play these various obligations or verifications. The other example of iterated PD is like the investigation of state behavior with nuclear technology by the IAEA and reporting on this. And so verification will help reduce cheating, defection, or free riding, but it is not always full because it's voluntary. I wanted to include examples of how actors can integrate themselves by including the treaties of the European Union that have gone on to become more integrated. And so even though we saw Brexit happen, it is at least for the past 75 to 80 years, it's been the rare case of separation or less integration. In fact, the world has moved more towards greater integration, verification, cooperation in those kinds of things. And so when we think about this growth in integration and cooperation, what might better explain increased integration and cooperation is really neoliberal institutionalism, international cooperation. And so these continuous interactions, because states will always interact with their neighbors or they belong to the same organizations, or even if it's at the United Nations, we see increased interactions, the creation of international organizations and intergovernmental organizations, IGOs. And these do a lot of things, for example, moderating state behavior, providing frameworks for interaction, establishing mechanisms, as we've mentioned, for example, IAEA to monitor and reduce cheating, facilitate transparency of state action. So states do not have to negotiate with 5 different agreements. They can sign on to the same agreement that is negotiated in common. They increase habits of cooperation. They gather information and surveillance. For example, IAEA can tell you which country is probably having a nuclear program sometimes. They settle disputes. For example, the international mechanism for settlement of disputes, ICPSD, conduct operational activities. So where they, for example, cooperate, like Airbus will conduct operational activities, or if you're thinking about, for example, NATO. International organizations are arenas for bargaining and the creation of international regimes. So again, as we mentioned, the laws, regulations, agreements, and so on. So because they interact continuously through these organizations, states can reciprocate cooperation or cheating. And so it's almost like equal measure. If you are known to be a state that defects, then other states might decide to not cooperate with you, or give you the semblance of cooperation but defect. But also there's expectations of reciprocity. No one state is self-sufficient in everything, and so there's almost necessity to cooperate. But also the shadow of the future, which is the expected length of interactions in the future, almost necessitate cooperation. So there are very few instances in which the shadow of the future changes. Think, for example, of the US and Canada, or US and Mexico. It's likely that these countries will be right next to each other for the foreseeable future. There are very few periods of time when this changes. I could probably point to the breakup of Yugoslavia, but also maybe the split in the Sudan, so South Sudan and Sudan, and so maybe Kenya no longer has an incentive to cooperate with the Sudan because now it's neighbors with South Sudan. But in many cases, the shadow of the future creates expectations for future interactions because you're right there, you will interact. And so positive interactions, reciprocity is a key element of current and future interactions. And so cooperative and non-cooperative behavior can be easily identified either through surveillance or even these repeated interactions. And states can align their expectations about cooperation. What does cooperation look like? When can they cooperate? In what kinds of instances? Really, one of the major examples of international cooperation by like the world's navies was Operation Atalanta, the anti-piracy effort on off the coast of Somalia. And if you think about why navies exist, mostly it's to fight other navies. And so international cooperation has increasingly taken place through intergovernmental organizations. These are groups of countries that have membership, for example, the United Nations, African Union, European Union. These are IGOs. But cooperation, for them to cooperate, they probably require more interests in common than more interest in conflict. So what is the thing that you're trying to solve? Piracy, I think, is bad for every country. It increases the cost of goods and people are hijacked and there's insecurity. Nuclear proliferation does the same thing. There's greater anxiety around the world and potential for annihilation. And so we talked about dilemmas of common interests and aversions, but also cooperation really does increase the benefits of cooperation and reduce costs. And we can all obviously talk about the alternatives to cooperation, such as deadlock, escalation, submission of military force. But international cooperation also does require fidelity to abiding by the agreements, even though some countries will actually sign treaties and then go on to violate them. I'm especially thinking of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But so when, as we mentioned previously, prisoners' dilemma, tit for tat, retaliation, and there's quite a bit of all these kinds of game theory strategies. But also countries can lose credibility if they're the ones who are known to always defect. So in terms of theory and maybe the application of game theory, there's quite a number of iterated types of games. This is actually a screenshot from Wikipedia. So occasionally, countries and individuals take actions that defy logic. So they are, if you sort of think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, so as part of these games, there are times when people will cooperate, there are people who will defect, and times when people will defect, there are times when they will partially defect. And so, for example, the stag hunt is often seen as partial defection because the fifth person actually does get the rabbit, but everyone else goes hungry. But so one of the most perhaps challenging is the game of chicken, and this might be what we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where one actor follows a certain course. And so the game of chicken is really, there are two iterations. Either you're driving towards a cliff, two cars driving towards a cliff, and the one that swerves, that person will be known as chicken forever. But think about what happens to the driver who is not chicken. The second iteration of the game of chicken is that two cars are driving towards each other at high speed, and the one who swerves is chicken. But imagine if none of them is chicken, then they are both, sort of smashed into the wrecks. And so this really not a good winner in chicken, because even if you win, you're a loser because in theory you're chicken. If you win, you're dead. So it's cooperation can avoid these kinds of outcomes. And so this other ways to think about game theory and its application to common human problems. So, for example, conflict, whether we are talking about, but a lot of these games will also be defined by Nash equilibrium, where everything is at equilibrium, but if you change the conditions in one, it distorts the equilibrium, and therefore, and if you sort of think about Germany's rise in the 1870s, this disrupted the equilibrium in Europe and almost necessitated or made inevitable the First World War. There are other explanations of cooperation. So, for example, human nature encourages cooperation, whether it is to defend selves against others, so there's still element of cooperation, but also the Kantian triangle of peace, or Kantian peace, seems to encourage republican states, trade, interdependence, and therefore cooperation. So economic interdependence and its benefits are seen to lessen incentives for and the likelihood of conflict, even though there are those others who argue that economic interdependence did not prevent Germany and England from going to war during the First World War, and may not stop the US and China from going to war someday in future, even though it is difficult to see how that could be beneficial to either of them. And so when we think about the Kantian triangle of peace, so democracy, because we if you talk about domestic audience costs, the view is that domestic audiences impose costs on government. Daniel Putnam is really has a great discussion on this. So they impose costs on their leaders, and the leaders are probably not willing to bear those costs, and so are less likely to go to war. But also, if you then mix that with democratic peace theory, that democracies are less likely to go to war, but then you have to think about how many democracies are really around. But so the economic interdependence can lessen incentives and likelihood of conflict, but also democratic peace theory that would rather go to McDonald's than go to war. So international institutions in this context, because that is one of Kantian triangle of peace tenets, international institutions, organizations, they facilitate cooperation because of agreements, coordinating of state behaviors, and making more states' commitments more credible. And so this is the Kantian peace triangle as a reminder, and some of what it brings. It brings about so institutions, peace, democracy, or institutions, and the outcomes that they bring. So let's turn briefly to constructivism. So you might remember that the whole argument by constructivists is that anarchy is what states make of it, and so conflict is what states make of it. States do exist, anarchy exists, but it doesn't have to be the default. Cooperation can be especially likely with states that have similar interests, convergent interests. And also states can be socialized to norms of cooperation. There's nothing that says that states have to fight or people have to fight. And so when we think about shared democratic rule and norms that can foster cooperation, then we can see the norm of cooperation developing. And so when we sort of dig deeper into constructivism, we see that things like state identities, nature of shared understandings, and the norms can be leveraged to create expectations for peace. If you go back to Japan and the US and the wars that they fought, or Germany and Europe and the conflict that pervaded the 1870s to about 1950s, almost a century. And now if you think about the peace that exists, unless perhaps it's an illusion, then we can see how states can be socialized to peace and to perhaps not con they are not necessarily going into conflict. Um, and so when we think about what countries will do and how they socialize themselves, again, the biggest example is the nuclear weapons held by Britain, France, and perhaps Israel, if it does have nuclear weapons, and how they are not perceived as threatening to Westerners or particularly Americans, because this is a socialization. And yet North Korea, I suspect, gives people sleepless nights. And so when we think about internationalism, we also have to turn to international law, even though the idea of international law is perhaps an anathema, because if there's no one to enforce these rules, how can there be law if there's no enforcer? The premise of states is that the state can enforce laws and rules and norms and behavior. And so, but over time we have seen the growth of things that are acceptable and those that are not, even in international community. And so we see norms and rules that regulate interactions between states, among states and other actors. We see them derived from customs and treaties, but we also see how these habits become ingrained. And so even when, for example, the US is at odds with North Korea, you will still see North Korean diplomats coming to the US because this is part of international law. And so when we think about examples of international law, the Outer Space Treaty or the Non-Proliferation Treaty, these are examples of frameworks and laws that guide how countries will conduct themselves. And so 1963 was perhaps part of the coldest part of the Cold War, and you can see the US, UK, USSR actually signing a treaty together. So there are perhaps dilemmas of common interests, how to go to space that they needed to agree on. And so international law recognizes sovereignty, but it also has a long history. So besides a country controlling its, because you can't really, I mean, how do you apply international law with failed states? But so we see a long history of international law. So for example, of War and Peace by Hugo Grotius, or people like Thomas Hobbes, and, beginning with the Leviathan within territory, but other individuals. But so we see, for example, now the United Nations Charter, the NATO Treaty, the League of Nations, the Rome Statute. All these are examples of treaties and agreements that bring about international conventions and sometimes regional agreements. And so specifically, there are three principles of international law and diplomacy. The principle of state comity, so reciprocity, how citizens are protected, so you don't necessarily lose your rights because you go to a different country, but also diplomatic immunity. And so when you have diplomats to one country, they are protected by international law. But also there are, laws that sometimes are, so for example, there will be things that states will do or not do. For example, Europe will not deport an individual who is facing, or extradite someone who is facing the death penalty in the US because European law does not provide for the death penalty. And so how states recognize other states and treat them and treat their citizens and protect their citizens. There's the act of state doctrine, where other states respect other states' legal proceedings and findings, even when they don't necessarily agree with them. Think about the death penalty in countries like Saudi Arabia and maybe China. But those are the laws, and what can other countries do? about that. And so usually this is expressed in the idea of the judicial branch of one country won't examine the validity of public acts done by a recognized foreign government within its own territory. Even when, again, you disagree with, for example, Uganda's attempt to impose the death penalty for same-sex relationships. And so the acts of a foreign nation do not come under the jurisdiction of local nations unless it's absolute criminality, like Umaru Diko's abduction. Now, the doctrine of state or sovereign immunity is the idea that the acts of representatives of foreign governments are protected when they are exercising the sovereign power. Their acts are protected. So, for example, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Sergei Lavrov, who is Russia's foreign minister, has been to the UN, and the US would probably like to not allow him to come to the US. However, probably as a private citizen he would not, but he is acting he is exercising sovereign power of the Russian Federation, and so the US cannot stop him from. Now, of course, when it's something like if you are indicted by the ICC, that might be different. And so there are certain variations of international law, but we shall not talk about those. But so this is a repeat of the principle of comity, act of state doctrine. And so again, there are things that are recognized by many jurisdictions. For example, child support. The US, I think, has maybe like 14 other countries they recognize the child support payments with, and so they will probably charge or collect those. But there's also the localization of international law or creation of law that facilitates this. Now, there are very many 6 or 7 dimensions of international law. So there's economic law, which governs things like trade, tariffs, currencies. There's international security law. So, for example, NATO. This would be mostly about security agreements. There's criminal law, which is the behavior of states or individuals crossing borders, especially now when we talk about genocides, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against aggression. These are covered by international criminal law, particularly under ICC, the Rome Statute. There's international environmental law. So if you think about, for example, the creation of UNEP, the United Nations framework on climate change, and so on, regulation of carbon, world's oceans, fisheries. For example, Japan coming into great grief for almost extinct whales. There's international diplomatic law, so customary international law, state immunity, sovereign immunity. There's international humanitarian law or law of war. We talked about this when we talked about war and conflict. So legality and justifications for war, wartime conduct, post-war conduct, and so on. There's also international human rights law. So the creation of international organizations and agencies as a result of human rights violations. So if you think about the Geneva Conventions, if you think about the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, European Convention on Human Rights, you might look at the Rome Statute as an example of international humanitarian law, but also the various tribunals, for example, the Tokyo Military Tribunal, the Nuremberg trials, and so on. And so all of these are examples of the development of international law. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt was very important in the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which in theory covers the whole world, but also Saudi Arabia and North Korea and Libya and a few other countries are signatories, which is yeah. So when we talk about international law, how is it enforced? Do states comply with it? And so we look at, for example, the UN invasion of Iraq in 2003, which violated the UN Charter, which the US is a signatory of. In fact, the US was instrumental in the formation of the UN. And we actually see a lot of violation of international law. Um, Things like, the right to life, right to decide who you marry. Those are, enshrined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, but countries still decide whether they can agree to this or not. Now, there's a vertical and horizontal enforcement of different laws. So, for example, the vertical enforcement, um, one actor constrains the authority or actions of another so that they can comply with the law. So, for example, European Court of Justice or ICJ. One of the more recent examples is, for example, the European Court of Human Rights refusing the transportation of illegal or undocumented migrants in the UK to Rwanda because, but also this was backed up by the UK Supreme Court. And so sometimes national courts can invoke universal jurisdiction, um, but also the horizontal enforcement is the idea that states can elicit compliance with international law by other states. So, for example, a good example was Sudanese President Hassan al-Bashir, who traveled to Nigeria while he was under indictment by ICC. He also traveled to South Africa, and non-profit or human rights groups went to the high courts, and the high courts demanded that he should be arrested. And so this is part of helping or forcing states to comply with international law, even though he was not necessarily arrested. Now, um, states, of course, have a self-interest in whether they will comply with the requirements reflects their self-interest. So, for example, if you commit genocide and go to the US will likely hand you over, even though it's not a signatory, actually withdraw the signature. And so when states can make rules in treaties, they benefit because they can have their preferences in there. Sometimes not participating in decision making can cost a state, as USSR found out with the North Korea, well, actually Korean War situation in 1950. But also compliance depends on whether states have something to gain or even can find a way to comply. So there are other ways to explain um, compliance with international laws and things like that. And so, for example, constructivism and liberalism have normative explanation uh, so that states will comply because it's the right thing to do. They desire to be seen as legitimate, which stems from negotiations and lawmaking process, but also the laws themselves are sources of legitimacy. So if you think about Canada's famed human rights and international development interests, this can be very useful um, in promoting the normative and ethical explanations or obligations that a country feels. And so, even though we are not going to talk much about this, we think about the types of enforcement. So, vertical enforcement, top down, vertical enforcement, bottom up, vertical enforcement or horizontal enforcement, the self interest, why states will do those kinds of things, but also norms and ethics. And it's probably useful to pause this to look at those. Now, there's also international criminal law, which has grown um, in importance recently. So this might be mutual legal assistance treaties. So coordination and cooperation in evidence gathering, sharing information, tracking suspects or witnesses, but also extradition treaties like delivering one person from one state to another. As I mentioned, Europe will not do that if someone is facing the death penalty. But there have been also the global treaties like human trafficking, terrorism, drug trafficking, and so on. Um, Even though there's politicization of international crime fighting, uh, for some states it's like Equatorial Guinea's president's son has a $300 million yacht and we're just going to seize it. But in other places, like in with the case of El Chapo and now his son, both extradited to the US, this can have political implications. Sometimes it's also like maybe um, the law breaking, but also protecting other people. So, for example, the Turkish attempted coup in 2016. Turkish officers flee to Greece, and Turkey requested the extradition, and um, Greece refused and granted them asylum because, again, the kinds of rights that they would be um, entitled to are probably not going to be found if they are returned. But also, sometimes countries will go and do bad things in other countries. Like during that coup or following that coup, there was a skirmish outside the U.S. residence of the Turkish ambassador when the Turkish president was visiting, and the U.S. is still seeking those individuals. Now, another element of international law is the UN Law of the Sea or UN Convention of the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS. So this governs the territorial waters and where the coastal waters extend. So there has been an international agreement that this extends to 12 miles from the coastline, but also countries have asserted 200 nautical miles from the coast. But also this doesn't cover internal waters. So, for example, the U.S. lakes named Holmes, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, these are not covered by so. But when you think about the 200 nautical miles from the coast, and you think about something like the um, South China Sea, this can bring about challenges in that, 200 nautical miles might be within the claim of another country. But also, if you actually look at the borders, for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, they don't always necessarily have a predictable way in which they go out to sea. So some countries often end up being feeling like they have been oppressed in the demarcation of borders. There's also the question, as I mentioned, of the high seas and who controls them, and the kinds of fishing and mining that goes on, and that has continued to become a challenge. And so this is really the definition of the territorial sea baseline, the contiguous zone, the kinds of assertions of sovereignty based on the territorial distance from the coast. Um, and so this is probably a better map to sort of think about the 12 nautical miles being territorial waters in the exclusive economic zone or EEZ. And then after the high seas. So, as I briefly mentioned, the question of China's claim for certain islands, for example, the Spratlys in Scarborough Shores, the Parasols, and the assertion, for example, that China makes that all of these, the South China Sea is basically its territory, sort of brings in challenges because you have Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Taiwan, which is a whole different question. And so, for example, China claims all these islands, and if indeed they are part of its territory, then you can see how the 12 miles and the 200 miles basically makes South China Sea China's property. This is another view towards the northeast and of course the Koreas, but also if you think about North Korea and how sometimes it asserts its sovereignty. For example, it fires missiles into the Sea of Japan, and this is probably one of the ways that it suggests that this is part of its territory. Um, Now, countries do generally conform to international law, but some countries decide when, where, how, why, and when not to conform. And so, one of the examples of this is the Connolly Reservation, which was inserted into, which was actually passed in maybe 1946 in a reaction to the idea of the compulsory universal jurisdiction um, of the International Court of Justice. And so the idea is that the US would accept compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ, but this declaration shall not apply to disputes with regard to matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States of America as determined by the United States of America. So the US will determine what is within its jurisdiction when it determines that that thing is within its jurisdiction, and that thing will not covered by international jurisdiction. So it's sort of like when we say it's up to us, then it's up to us, and whoops. So, this is not necessarily in the good order of international law, but countries can decide to actually make it explicit. So this was, for example, passed by Congress, I believe the Senate, which ratifies treaties. And so you can sort of see how this is deflating to international law. And this ties into those countries that feel bigger than maybe other countries. And, again, we go back to Animal Farm and, what countries are bound by and what they agree to be bound by. But also we have to remember that international organizations do a lot. They pool resources, they do joint production, they elaborate norms. And if you think about war, but also cooperation, for example, the idea that the Airbus is built by a consortium of British, French, and German companies, but also the Eurofighter. So imagine countries cooperating to build weapons of war, including, for example, the UK, France aircraft carriers. So maybe international organizations and international cooperation does actually work, but I think the biggest example is still continues to be the Universal Declaration, well, the UN Charter, and how countries can cooperate, whether it's during floods or to rescue to rescue Kuwait from the shackles of Iran, or to bring peace to Timor-Leste. I think we, the peoples of the United Nations, can still collaborate and give international law and its elements a chance. I think we shall conclude this discussion here. I welcome any questions and comments in the space below the video. Goodbye.